So what I'm about to share has nothing to do with the sermon, but I'm very excited. I learned this yesterday. How many people know who Alex Cora is? Manager of the world champion Red Sox. And we know that Alex Cora is from Puerto Rico, very proud to be a Puerto Rican. And I found out yesterday that he was raised in an American Baptist church in Puerto Rico. How cool is that? So I'm thinking I'm going to give Alex a call and just say, what are you doing on Sunday? I know he's down in Puerto Rico right now, but during the season, home games. A lot of American Baptist churches active in Puerto Rico. Who knew? Who knew? Please pray with me. What's that? He is. All right, so when you see Alex Cora at the Patriots game tonight, where Dwayne is working, invite him to church. Please pray with me. God of grace, God of hope, God of peace. Speak to us of the possibilities that come when we open ourselves to your timeless message, to your ancient words. And may God's people say, amen. So Jesus and the disciples had been working hard, kind of 24/7. They had been healing, they'd been teaching, and they needed a chance just to be by themselves. So they went to the outskirts of this little backwater town just to rest. But the crowds heard about Jesus and where his disciples were. So the crowd of about 5,000 or so folk showed up on their doorstep. They wanted to be taught. They wanted to be healed. And it says that Jesus welcomed them. Another translation is Jesus had compassion on them. He saw their needs. He saw their brokenness. He saw their longings. And as tired as he and his disciples were, he welcomed them. He made a space for them. And then, verse 12, we hear these words. Late in the afternoon, the 12 came to him, the disciples, and said, "Send the crowd away so that they can go to surrounding villages and countryside and find food and lodging, because we are in a remote place." Makes sense, right? 12 disciples, Jesus, how are they going to take care of all of these 5,000? Send them away. Let them go out to the villages. Let them harvest some food, stop in the stores, and take care of themselves and find a place to lay their head for the night. And then Jesus says this in verse 13. Jesus replied, "You give them something to eat." And the disciples answered, "We have only 5 loaves and 2 fish, unless we go and buy food for all the crowd." Is that what you want us to do, Jesus? You want us to take what limited funds we have and try to provide for 5,000 people? It's impossible. And if you're looking at it through the eyes of the disciples, it makes sense, right? There are limits. Parker Palmer refers to this as the economy of scarcity, that there are only so many resources to go around, that you have to be realistic, you have to be practical, you have to take care of yourself and your family or your tribe first and foremost. That's the economy of scarcity. There's only so much to go around. It's how our world operates, right? It's reasonable. So here's a crowd that we've seen in the news in recent weeks. This is a crowd that's marching through Mexico from El Salvador and Honduras and Guatemala. They are fleeing poverty, they're fleeing violence. El Salvador has the highest murder rate in the world. So you see this crowd, and they are marching towards our U.S. border to apply for asylum. Fleeing poverty, fleeing violence. Our president would tell us that we are to be afraid of this crowd. And when you look at a crowd, I can see the point that he's trying to make. Because it's hard to see the individuals in that mass of humanity, right? That's a big crowd. They're coming towards our border. Our president has ordered the military to stand guard against these 2,000 to 3,000 people. marching towards our border. This is the economy of scarcity in action. Now, people may be saying, I'm being political right now. I'm not really. I'm being theological. This is the economy of scarcity. There's only so much to go around. That's how the disciples believed. That's how they operated. And that's how we operate today. This is political action put into practice, governed by the economy of scarcity. But this is a theological argument. Verse 14 through 16, Jesus said to his disciples, "Have them sit down in groups of about 50 each, taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, which was all that they had, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and he broke them, and then he gave them to the disciples to give to the people." I think there's something fundamental in our human condition. When we look at a crowd, when we look at a mass of humanity, it's easier for us to be indifferent to the plight of others. It's just so many faces, so many people. It was easy for the disciples to be overwhelmed by the needs of 5,000. All they saw was a sea of humanity. But Jesus understood their hearts, understood their minds, understands our hearts and our minds, and he said, break them into companies of 50. And so the people sat down and they began to look at each other. They began to ask each other their name, ask about their children. They began to see each other not as a mass of humanity, not as a horde, not as a crowd, but as individuals with names and needs and hopes and dreams just like them. Parker Palmer says the miracle in this story was that Jesus and his disciples took what little they had out of their scarcity and in an act of profound vulnerability laid it all before the 5,000. And then Parker Palmer suggests an interpretation of this story is that the people began to look at one another. And because there were not shopping centers around every corner, the people would have gone out to this remote setting with food. But they were hiding it. They were hoarding it for themselves. Someone had some dried fruit. Someone had some dry meat. Someone had some dry fish for the journey. Someone had some vegetables from their garden up their sleeve or in a pouch. And they saw Jesus lay what little they had in front. And then looking at this group of 50, because now they knew each other's name. Now they knew the stories of their children. Now they knew their hopes and the dreams. Then one by one, they began to take what little they had and they put it in the circle to be shared fully and freely amongst the 50. Jesus says, these are my sisters, these are my brothers, and they are your sisters and brothers as well. And Parker Palmer, the theologian, says, this is the first recorded potluck dinner in history. Because those who came with a lot still had enough. Anne, who forgot to bring anything, Dwayne was sharing what he had with her. There was enough for everybody. And Parker Palmer says this is the gospel of abundance. It's the alternative to the economy of scarcity, how our world operates. It's the way of Jesus where what I have belongs to you. And when we see each other in community with one another, when we see ourselves responsible and accountable one to the other, then we are transformed by the gospel of abundance. It's not how our world always operates. But Jesus wasn't about how the world operates now. He's about how our world and how we as individuals can function. He calls us to a different way of being. And do we believe this to be true? Verse 17, they all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. That's an amazing story. Now, this isn't to say that Jesus was not capable of bringing about the bread, bringing about the fish for all 5,000. I think nothing is impossible through the power of God. But I also like Parker Palmer's interpretation about breaking into small groups, learning each other's story, and being moved to an act of compassion. This is the gospel of abundance, and we see it in action here at First Baptist all the time. Generosity, even extravagant generosity, breaks forth through our shared coming together as a people. There's a little house on the other side of our parking lot called the White Whale. And in that place, miracles take place all the time. I've been in there half a dozen times in the last few years that I've been with you, last 4.5 years. I've been invited by people who want to go to their first AA meeting or their first NA meeting, and they're afraid to go. So they ask, Kent, will you go with me? And so I do. And to go into a meeting of the White Whale is to see what the church is all about. It's about people realizing that they need God to overcome their addiction. It's about people understanding they need community, they need support to overcome their addiction. It's a beautiful thing when we see abundance put into practice, and as a church, we make that space available. And over 1,000 people every week go into that house to find healing and hope. Extravagant generosity. We have 3 meals that are shared every week. Meals that feed people, but also a sense of belonging and community. We have people who informally listen and pray with one another. I've seen members of our church praying for the other out on the sidewalk because that person has just shared something going on in their life, and the person says, can I just give you a hug and can I offer a prayer? Recognizing the needs and the presence of another. I think of Harbor Light Community Partners, which we are a part of, which this church founded some years ago, how we just opened 26 beautiful apartments for people who had been living on the streets. 26 people who now have a place to call their own, safe and secure sense of dignity and respect through the extravagant generosity of a humble church like ours. This weekend, our Middle High Fellowship are at Grottenwood American Baptist Camp in Groton, Massachusetts, and looking at the Facebook page and posting some wonderful things are going on, creating a space for kids to come together. That is the gospel of abundance. When we recognize it's not about me and mine, but sharing God's love as best we can. This past Sunday, 300 of our neighbors gathered at Temple B'nai Abraham to grieve for the murdered 11 at Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. We gathered civic leaders, representatives from 10 congregations to stand with our Jewish sisters and brothers. What drew us together was the biblical teaching that we are sisters and brothers one to another. We are children of God, created in the image of God. But the seeds for my being there grew out of a relationship with Rabbi Allison Adler. Can I see that next slide? There. So this is Rabbi Allison at Temple B'nai Abraham. This is her home. And for the last 4 Passovers, Tricia and I have been invited into their home to share in the Passover meal. And Rabbi Allison and her husband Chuck and their little boy Leo, they have been in our home too. So that when that event happened at Tree of Life Synagogue this past a week ago Saturday, the pain of my Jewish brothers and sisters was personal because Rabbi Allison is my friend. And when you mess with my rabbi, you're messing with me. It's about community. It's about relationship. It's the gospel of abundance where we belong to one another. And that's what Jesus wanted the disciples to understand, to break people into kind of bite-sized communities where you can see each other and know each other and become friends and responsible and accountable to one another. Rabbi Allison knows that I have her back, and I know that she has my back. And if we as a church were ever to go through a challenging time, the people at Temple B'nai Abraham would have our back because we belong to one another. So that's the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. Seeing the face of God in one another. As stewards of God's gifts, we are called to share God's love and support God's working within these walls, but most importantly, beyond. It's a privilege to journey with you, and I give thanks for your generous spirit. And may God's people say, amen.